I would have not expected, by the time I graduated from medical school in Damascus, to find myself 17 years later working in a malnutrition hospital in the south of Niger. The plan was to have a cushy surgeon's life, a busy schedule, a private practice, a divorce, a couple of kids that would spend all the money that I work hard for. Yet, here I am, at the crack of dawn, walking down the dirt roads of Magaria, on my way to the hospital for the morning rounds. For an urban boy like me, coming from Damascus, a 5 million people metropolis, the dusty and hot streets were anything but my natural habitat. But as the days rolled on, I started getting familiar with my surroundings, and people started recognizing me. I'd get a good morning from the boy who sold motorcycle fuel out of used alcohol bottles. And I would get a hand wave from the people gathering around the only radio in town. Then a right turn comes and puts the morgue of the pediatric hospital in sight. And I would know how difficult the night before was from the number of people in line to receive the bodies of their children whose lives have been cut short by famine. Knowing that circumstances like this existed is the reason I started working in humanitarian assistance. And cutting that line shorter was why we operated a hospital where 400 children will be admitted at any given time, suffering from malnutrition in that period of peak malnutrition. Images like this are plastered in our streets, in tube stations, on television, telling you about crises that happen in faraway lands and asking for your support. Images of sick children, of bombed neighborhoods, of floods that cover whole villages, and of families crossing borders to flee conflict and persecution. I often wonder about the impact of such images. Torn away from their contexts and their histories, and separated from their environments, from the sounds and the smells that are so integral to them. Journalists and humanitarian organizations use images such as this one, often of people at their most vulnerable, to communicate what they see on the ground. Those images can horrify us, can shock us, but they can never tell us a story. They risk turning people we try to help into objects, objects for us to act upon, objects worthy of pity, of charity. They also risk turning our momentary horror and shock into numbness and neglect, and prevent us from hearing what people have to say. We often found that delivering humanitarian medical work while being at the core of our mandate is not enough. For us to be able to propagate any change, we have to be close to people. We have to work with them. We have to witness their plight and help them deliver their voice. And if that's not possible, to speak out on their behalf. Sharing an image is not enough. A photo will not cut it. The narrative and the story have to be delivered. You'd feel very differently if I told you about the number of hours this woman had to walk in the searing heat to reach our hospital, that she had left her children behind, and that every day she spends in the hospital is a day she doesn't work and they do not eat, and that her kid is about to receive her third blood transfusion in 2 days. Yet she perseveres, and she makes decisions that we will find very hard to understand. In the past year, my colleagues, my national and international colleagues in Doctors Without Borders in MSF, have treated nearly 10 million people suffering anything from war wounds to severe malaria. They conducted surgeries, they administered vaccines, and they fed and treated malnourished children. They also rescued tens of thousands of people crossing the sea, fleeing violence. And on a better note, they also helped 250,000 mothers deliver their babies. But numbers are only one part of the story. And statistics, while being important, are sometimes conceal people's identities and hide their voices. Indeed, we do not only need pictures and numbers and facts and figures. What we need is empathy and solidarity. Empathy and solidarity are neither the exclusive privilege of humanitarian aid workers, nor are they an optional accessory for anyone who's chosen any other route in life. Without such solidarity, both political and humanitarian, we risk not only losing the people who suffer from crises, but also losing ourselves. For the voice and the face of everyone who suffers to be delivered, they need to be able to tell their story. And when they cannot do that, we have to speak out in sympathy and often in anger at their circumstances. Talking on their behalf, delivering their voices can happen in many ways. And the images you see are only one of them. The humanitarian advocacy can be delivered in ways that range from meetings behind closed doors into loud and wide campaigns that tell militaries that humanitarian hospitals in conflicts are not a target, or ask pharma to reduce the unaffordable prices of life-saving vaccines. So, what is it that could be done? What happens spontaneously sometimes is that we burst out in anger and in solidarity when the body of a child is washed on the shores of Turkey, or when hundreds of thousands of Rohingyas are pushed away from their villages in Myanmar by violence. But it shouldn't take such extreme occasions for people to pay attention. Firstly, we have to get engaged, and for any engagement to happen, we should start by knowing and by understanding. We can be horrified momentarily by images, but for any engagement and action that is meaningful to take place, we have to understand. And such understanding, in my opinion, has a few prerequisites. One of which is to move away actively from seeing people who are affected by crisis as the other that is fundamentally different from ourselves and that we might choose to help out of the goodness of our hearts. We should learn against all prejudices and against biases of the media that is happy to dedicate endless hours to storms that hit Texas or Florida, and nearly none to ones that affect Bangladesh. That puts entire focus on the refugees that are crossing the sea to Europe, and very little on those that cross borders to Tanzania or Bangladesh. Such understanding might seem difficult. After all, the 25 years of war in Somalia, or the blockade that paralyzes Yemen for the past years, are not things you could binge watch on Netflix. The good news, though, is that getting curious and actually quenching that thirst for knowledge is intensely rewarding. And learning about a country and a people is by far more exciting than knowing the map of Middle-earth or understanding the houses of Game of Thrones. But for such understanding can happen even better. You can go and hear about it from people who lived and survived it. You can listen to their poetry. You can read their literature. You can attend their debates. And you can try to see the world from their point of view. And only a few tube stations from here, you can find a Syrian, a Palestinian, a Somali, or a Congolese who'd be happy to tell you what you want to know. And that usually happens over a delicious dinner and endless cups of tea. Secondly, the knowing and understanding will evoke an emotional and intellectual engagement. That is solidarity. That is a sense of unity, of common purpose, and of mutual aid to people for no other reason than being able to walk that metaphorical mile in their shoes. And thirdly, and finally, knowing, understanding, and having solidarity will provoke action. That is not only sending that SMS that will give 3 quid to your preferred charity. That is unfortunately not enough. Action is allowing your solidarity, working with it, so it can spread and, like a benevolent infection, affect others. The World Bank tells us that in 2015, $150 billion were given in international aid. And international aid is sadly not one that goes only to humanitarian or developmental assistance. Much of that has gone to military and political aid. And your tax money are part of that. And it is by far larger than any amount you would give in a check for a charity. And knowing and understanding and having solidarity is actually insisting that your contributions follow your convictions. The answer might be being part of a movement, whether that's a movement to allow humanitarian assistance, or a movement that stands beside people who face misogyny, who face racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, or any other phobia that they care to throw in our face. But the critical question remains, why would you do that? Why would you go out of your way to learn, to understand, and to act on your solidarity? For me, that happened while I walked those streets. That happened when I could remember the stories told to me by my aunt, a woman larger than life, and my father, about their village in the south part of Syria in the 50s, about their black stone house, about their fields and dusty roads. Those all were reflected in the place I was walking in then. And in it as well was reflected every village in my country and every village I worked with and in that has been wiped by war or pillaged by disease. And then and there, any difference between me and the people I was out there to serve diminished. It took me many years of working in humanitarian assistance and 7 years war in my own country for me to understand and for me to feel solidarity. But I did, at last. Many will tell you that the other is not worth your time, that your money and your emotions are better spent on people that look and talk and behave exactly like you do. They will argue, they will write, they will shout, and they will vote, so those others cannot take our resources, our jobs, or our culture. And they will tell you that whatever those others suffer from is their own fault. Don't be deceived. It doesn't take a crisis in your life or a conflict in your country for you to understand and to act. All it takes is to allow that poster to become a mirror. And instead of seeing the other in it, to see those lines through knowing and understanding blur, and to see yourself in that other. That, my friends, is true solidarity. Thank you.